I'd like to welcome all of you to this excellent presentation, the speaker that's come from Washington, D.C. to visit us today. Todd Moss is going to be talking about Africa on the Rise, how the forgotten continent is more important than ever to the United States. So Todd Moss is the Chief Operating Officer and Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development. I was lucky enough to be his colleague for several years before going to grad school and then before coming here. And Todd Moss was one of the many PhDs at the Center for Global Development who inspired me to go into academia so that I would know some things when I tried to make a policy impact later on in my life. So I can blame any of my poor career choices on people like Todd. But also, I think one of the exciting things about having Todd here today is that he is a living, breathing example of how good academics can make a real impact in the world. I know that the students that are in this room today who are working through the math and the quant methods and all of this in their classrooms can get frustrated because they don't see how regression analysis can possibly be applied to fixing development problems in poor countries. But I think Todd can tell you that his knowledge of economics and political science helped him shape the face of, say, Nigeria with the debt restructuring initiative that he worked on at CGD. I hope you'll ask him questions about things like this that he's done in his many years at CGD. Todd is also the author of this book. If you were in my Africa development class, you read it, hopefully. And I had some really great feedback from it, so I'm glad that he can be here as well. He's also the author of The Golden Hour, which is maybe a more fun book to read. I've just started reading it. It's fiction, and this is why I'm tired today, because it's hard to put down once you start. It's a thriller. It takes place partly in Mali, which is my favorite West African country, and I'm happy to say that the wife of the protagonist is also named Jessica, so I highly recommend reading this book. And without further ado, I hand it over to Todd Moss.
Thanks, Jessica. It's great to be here, and thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Andrew, for coming to see me a couple of weeks ago and inviting me to come here. I think the work of the Bush School is critically important in helping to build a robust constituency across America for United States engagement around the world. We don't want to be the policeman for the world, but the nature of the world the way it is today, we have to be engaged in all kinds of places, including in places that maybe we don't want to always be engaged in. But I hope I will convince you today that Africa is a region that maybe a lot of Americans don't think much about. They think it feels very far away. Liberia can feel very far from Texas, but that actually, because of the way the world is working, and in particular because of the kinds of both worrying threats and, more importantly, positive opportunities that are out there, we're getting pulled closer and closer together in a way that we're not maybe fully prepared, and which the next generation of policymakers, which I hope some of you will become, will help us do better. So that's the sort of set. I'm hoping, I'll try to be quick and leave lots of time for questions. I started working on Africa. It was fairly random. I was a college student in Boston at Tufts, and I thought it would be cool to go to Africa. I had really nothing more noble than that. And I went and did a semester in Zimbabwe. I got off the plane. I sort of had no idea what to expect, and I was just shocked when I got there. I could not believe, I'm from Rochester, New York originally. I could not believe how much Harare, Zimbabwe felt like Rochester. It was just very normal, right? It was different in many ways, which was the exciting part. But I live with a Zimbabwean family. We talked about stuff over dinner. It's kind of like my own family. We talked about sports, traffic, what's going on at work. And with that, it gave me a sort of level of familiarity where I thought Africa is not another planet. It's actually just another place around the world. fantastically exciting in lots of ways that hooked me. I got what some of us call the Africa bug. I don't know if you talk about the Africa bug. If you find people who have the Africa bug, they will not knowingly nod, but people can become hooked on it. I got hooked, started working on it, and basically I've been doing that for 25 years. I'm starting now to feel a little bit like the world is catching up to the Africa funds, and I think that's only positive. Another message is that Africa is really changing extremely rapidly. Even countries, I go to Accra, Ghana fairly regularly. It looks different, 2 years later. The amount of construction, I haven't been to Lagos, Nigeria for a couple of years. I can imagine how different it looks to what I saw a few years ago. So it's moving incredibly rapidly, and in mostly positive ways, actually. And so it's forcing even me, who's been following it closely, following many countries of the continent closely for a long time, it's forcing me to constantly reassess, what's going on here. So I want to talk about the opportunities of Africa for the United States. And here I had this tremendous opportunity that was, again, a series of complete accidents that I had the opportunity to serve in the State Department as Deputy Assistant Secretary in 2007, 2008. Took leave from the think tank, went to the State Department, and then came back and got a terrific window into how the U.S. government works, the sausage machine of foreign policy making, but also it forced me to change my thinking a little bit from an academic trying to push ideas to, okay, wait, how do you actually really influence people that have levers to make real change? And of course, in the State Department, Africa is pretty low on the hierarchy. And we started to see it rising up. I'll talk about that in a second. But it did seem to me that the United States government was both understating our national security needs in Africa and at the same time just missing a huge number of opportunities for the United States. So I'm kind of bringing a public policy, U.S. foreign policy lens to a lot about this. So I'm going to talk quickly about humanitarian concerns that we have, economic opportunity, national security issues, some of the new threats, walk you through why I think Africa is more important than ever before, a little bit touch on, well, how are we actually doing, how's the U.S. government adapting to this reality, and then we can have, throw any question you want at me. I'll probably end with a little story about why I wrote a thriller instead of another nerdy book. So a couple of structural points on the U.S. government. I don't know if, I hope Andrew will agree with some of these points, but I think the U.S. government has multiple interests around the world. We care about human rights, we care about democracy, we care about national security, we care about a list. Lael Brainerd at the Brookings Institution, before she went to the U.S. Treasury, wrote a list of all U.S. interests that have around the world, and she came up with more than 50. Now, many times these things come together and there's a confluence of interests. That's actually quite rare. More often we find that we have to make decisions and our interests conflict. Second is that, yes, we are the United States. We see ourselves as Americans in a particular view. Our foreign policy has values living throughout it, and that is who we see, who we are, what our role in the world is. It's what Congress expects. It's what the White House expects. And I think we can overdo it, but we should be unapologetic about standing up for particular values that we believe we should promote. And then the third point is that the U.S. government is huge and sprawling and frustratingly fragmented. And as much as we'd like to think that policy starts from a noble idea and then a very rational strategy and then all the teams are sent out to operate, it doesn't happen that way. Decisions are often made because of the dynamics of, you could politely call it negotiation among the different factions, or you might call it passive-aggressive bureaucratic infighting, or you can sometimes call it bureaucratic warfare, which actually leads to a lot of the decisions, and very often we'll explain why what we're doing actually doesn't seem to make that much sense. How did that possibly happen? So I think we want to think about high-minded values, but also think a bit about the structure of how our government works, or sometimes doesn't work, that gets us to good or bad decisions. I would actually argue that given the structure and the complexity of U.S. foreign policy making, that it's rare when, it works best when we're very clear on goals and we're very clear on the trade-offs that we have to make between conflicting goals. So the government, you will often hear when she was Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, often talk about the 3 Ds, diplomacy, defense, and development. And that these are the 3 legs of the stool, and they all come together, and they all support each other. And on very rare occasions, they do all come together and support each other, but it's typically the exceptions that prove the rule. There's a phrase that's thrown around. The White House just put this in their Ebola response press release, which is called whole of government. Now, the good interpretation of whole of government is that we have lots of capabilities across the government. The Defense Department can do things that other agencies can't do. USAID can do things that other agencies can't do. HHS, Every agency has some particular skill that they feel they bring to the table. So when we've got a complex problem, why not all hands on deck? Why not whole of government? It almost never works, and so we start around the Center for Global Development, we start calling it whole of government. We just spell it without the W in whole. But I think that the whole of government problem becomes especially apparent when you either have a very urgent crisis, like you have to respond quickly, and you've got 25 people around the table rather than 3 to make decisions. And it also, I've seen it repeatedly in our relationship with a lot of countries and issues that are relevant in Africa, because it's seen as lower level. You don't have, say, a White House staffer coming in and cracking heads and creating order and saying very clearly, this is what we want to do in Cote d'Ivoire after the election. This is what we're going to do. DOD, you do that. The White House is just not going to be able to do that. The President's National Security Staff is about 140 people. State Department Africa Bureau, 1,500 people. That's just the one Africa Bureau, State Department. Multiply that out, State Department's like about 12,000 people, DOD's hundreds of thousands of people, you've got dozens of other agencies, 140 people sitting in the White House can't possibly make that coherent. Now, the one positive thing I'd say is that as Africa becomes more important, we're actually seeing a bit of clarification about what are we trying to achieve, and that I think is only positive. I want to be very brief in just talking about humanitarian response. I think the important thing to say here is that Africa is, of course, a source of humanitarian problems on occasion. HIV/AIDS is a major one. The Ebola crisis that we're living through right now, another example. Conflict that the U.S. would seek to try to end and support peace. Responding to famine, other kinds of crises. The U.S. is going to respond to these things. We can be as hard-hearted and hard-nosed as we want and say, this is not in the U.S. interest. But it's very clear that our political process, and getting back to the values, is going to force us to respond. And it can actually respond in some kind of sort of unpredictable ways. A Twitter campaign, a hashtag campaign, Kony 2012, led to the deployment of U.S. Special Forces in Central Africa. Now, those of us that have followed Uganda and Central Africa, Kony's been around for a long time. This was not new, but it is, maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, Jessica, you have better insights into this. A social media campaign that hit my son's middle school in suburban Maryland actually helped to build momentum for the deployment of U.S. Special Forces. Now think about that for a second. We saw that with Bring Back Our Girls, the Nigerian kidnapping that led to Special Forces deployment. And I think part of it is that we have to expect in this age of crises, expectations on the U.S. government, and the power of social media, and frankly, the penetration of places like the White House, the State Department, and congressional offices by very small organized constituencies, These are not anomalies. We're going to have a lot more of these things in the future. Let me talk about what I most want to talk about, which is economic opportunities in Africa. The positive story. I think in many people's mind, Africa is still sort of Ethiopia of the 1970s. It's rural, it's agricultural, it's very poor, it's not really going anywhere. And compared to Asia, you know, the classic graph in every textbook, including in my own, I'm sorry to say, has Nigeria and Indonesia, or Ghana and Korea from 1960, and it's just like this. But the reality right now is, at least for the last 10 years, African economies have been booming. More than half of the economies are growing at least 5% per year. We've got a number of economies growing in the 8 to 10% per year steadily. This is not a one-off, you know, a single oil discovery, you get 16% and then it goes away. These are sustained issues, sustained trends that we're seeing. The exciting part of this, so part of the economic opportunity is, of course, traditional commodities, oil, gas, minerals. Virtually every country in Africa with a coastline had a major oil or gas discovery in the last couple of years. There's obviously a lot of excitement there. I want to come back to an oil myth. This is important for Africa. It's actually not important for the United States. That's not the reason we should be engaged there. But the really exciting part is that when we look underneath the macro numbers, the exciting sectors are not the extractive sectors. What's driving most of the high rates of economic growth are services sector. So we're looking at telecommunications, business services, IT in some cases, financial services, banking. Look at a country like Ethiopia that's growing at roughly 10% per year, and they have virtually no extractive sector. That's very exciting. Now, why is that exciting? That's exciting because it's more than Chevron and Rio Tinto that's getting excited about it. It's also showing that those kinds of services sectors, the benefits of services sector growth spread among populations much more than very narrow enclave projects. It's hard to turn an enclave project into broad-based growth. When it's in the banking or agriculture sector, it's very easy, it spreads. So what we're seeing in a place like Nigeria is going through this transition that we went through in the 1930s, 1940s, where millions of families in Nigeria are buying the very first refrigerator that the family's ever had, the first television, the first family car. And that is creating massive consumer demand. What we've seen with cell phones is just sort of tip of the iceberg. So companies like General Electric, I don't know if we get more American than General Electric. General Electric, the market they are most excited about around the world is Nigeria. They invested $1 billion in an assembly plant in Calabar. Anybody here heard of Calabar? Most Americans never heard of it, okay? But GE knows about it. They just put $1 billion there. So those kinds of trends are creating massive opportunities for American companies. Just under 2 months ago, President Obama hosted 50 African delegations. It went actually pretty well. I'll talk about that in a second. But the really exciting piece was actually the business summit that was accompanying it on the first day, where there was over $14 billion in commitments from companies like IBM, Walmart, Coca-Cola to invest in African markets. You'll also see, if you talk to private equity fund managers, they're very excited about a lot of African markets. Tiny Rwanda. Many people think of Rwanda, immediately think 1994 genocide. Rwanda last year went to the Eurobond market for their first re-entry into the private debt markets, 4 times oversubscribed, 4 times. And if you go to visit African capitals, cities like Nairobi in Kenya, Accra in Ghana, Lagos in Nigeria, Dakar in Senegal, certainly Johannesburg, these are bustling cultural centers of commerce. These are global hubs. They're becoming the way that we think of big cities in Europe, Latin America, and Asia. Now, I don't want to gloss over political problems that persist. Yes, there's lots of poverty, there's all of these other issues that Africa's been struggling with. They're not gone, but the trajectory is extremely positive, and I think we should think of Africa as extremely, of course, extremely heterogeneous, right? Chad and Kenya are nothing alike. Niger and Nigeria, even though the press sometimes confuses those, nothing alike. But in general, we should be thinking of Africa, large chunks of Africa as very dynamic regions of the world that are not what maybe we imagine in our popular mind. At the same time, if we think about the national security threats the United States faces, until a couple of weeks ago, we probably wouldn't have put Russia at the top of that list anymore. But when we think about this sort of over the next 20, 30, 40 years, what are the principal threats to the United States? These are transnational hidden networks of either terrorists or criminals that threaten the United States, cartels. And these networks seek what the Defense Department calls ungoverned spaces, or places where local governments cannot effectively control. So, for example, the terrorism networks, I think, are probably the most obvious to all of us. The seminal moment was 1998 when Al-Qaeda bombed our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. What we've seen, I don't know if you saw on the news, the Westgate shopping mall attack in Kenya. In 2009, on Christmas, the underwear bomber on Northwest flight from Amsterdam to Detroit was actually from Nigeria. There was an Algerian gas plant with lots of Westerners that was seized in 2013. We're seeing a series of these incidents, and we're seeing regions of the world start to become highly vulnerable to terror groups. And as we've hit Al-Qaeda in the Middle East, they sort of popped up in other places. In Somalia, we have Al-Shabaab. In Nigeria, we now have Boko Haram. And in parts of the Sahara Desert, we have Al-Qaeda type groups, most prominent of which is called Akim, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, that are there. They're sort of operating in similar places, although with very different goals and methods, than narco-traffickers. A lot of the heroin going into Europe is coming through West Africa. A lot of cocaine is coming from Latin America into West Africa. The country of Guinea-Bissau is largely considered a narco state. Basically, the state has been taken over by, so penetrated that it's basically run by narco traffickers. And then, of course, we also have transnational disease, an issue that I think is foremost on a lot of people's minds. These are all issues that are not going to go away and are going to force the United States to work much, much more closely with our African allies, and unfortunately have to respond in certain cases where the allies are not up to the task of containing those problems. So what's been our response so far? In general, to all these shifts in Africa. So if we go back to the Clinton administration, end of the Cold War, everybody thought, foreign policy, foreign policy is not as important anymore. Our aid program, it's only one indicator, our aid program to Africa absolutely went off a cliff. It actually went sub $600 million a year, which maybe sounds like a big number, but that's less than a single bilateral program today. Total to all of sub-Saharan Africa was under 600 million. I think Clinton and his people recognized that this was untenable. They started putting the pieces back in place for trying to elevate Africa within the hierarchy, and the signature sort of a contribution of the Clinton administration to U.S. Africa policy is something called AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is still with us. It's essentially a trade program for preferential access to the U.S. market by African countries. It's a very, very flawed piece of legislation, but it's not bad. But at least it put trade and trade relations on a higher level with the continent. Under President Bush, we actually saw a pretty, I think for many people, surprising. I don't think, President George W. Bush did not run on a robust Africa policy. He did not have anything in his history that suggested Africa was going to be part of his legacy. But his policy, he's left a large number of signature efforts that are still with us today. And really the bedrock of the U.S. relationship with Africa are still Bush-era efforts. There are several. The three most prominent, one is PEPFAR, which is the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. That is still with us today. The President's Malaria Initiative, PMI, which is still sort of with us in a different form. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, which he launched a new federal agency that makes grants to poor, well-governed countries based on a 5-year compact of shared metrics. It's a totally different way of doing aid. That's still with us. And then in 2008, right at the end of the administration on the national security side, the Bush administration stood up a fully autonomous regional combatant command, the Africa Command, or AFRICOM. Those are all still with us. So President Obama came to office, extremely high expectations, Kenyan father. A lot of the Democratic Africa advisors were talking very ambitiously about a whole new era of U.S.-Africa relations. Came to power with a big thud. I've got a piece in Foreign Affairs from 2012 called MIA, Missing in Africa, about Obama's failed first term. First term on Africa policy, at least. They did launch 3 initiatives. The White House launched 3 initiatives. I would be interested if any of you have heard of any of these. They launched the Global Health Initiative. They launched Feed the Future, a food security initiative, and they launched a Clean Energy Initiative in Africa. Feed the Future got off to a late start. It's still with us. It's kind of limping along. The Clean Energy Initiative was announced, but nothing ever happened. And the Global Health Initiative, which was supposed to convert PEPFAR into health systems, was announced with great fanfare, a $64 billion commitment from Secretary Clinton, and by the end of 4 years, it was totally abandoned. So that was not good. The signals were also not very good. President Obama spent less than 24 hours in Africa. He essentially flew into Ghana to give a speech to the parliament, lectured the parliament about democracy, and then left. That did not go over very well. And frankly, to my mind, the worst aspect of the first term of the Obama administration on Africa policy is that they did exactly the opposite of what they should be doing, which is pushing the national security and economic issues up higher. Instead, they said, no, we're about all kinds of third-tier issues. We're about everything. If you go to the President Obama's fact sheet, which the White House released on their accomplishments in Africa policy for the first term, the very first item listed is that the President hosted a youth forum with emerging African leaders. A very big program called YALI, Young African Leadership Initiative. It's a very nice program. They bring over about 500 young African leaders, train them. There's nothing wrong with YALI. There's nothing wrong with the President hosting a youth forum. But it is the opposite of serious foreign policy. The idea that President Obama would go to Mexico or to India and have youth engagement be a signature pillar of our policy, it would be insulted. The Indians would be insulted. And it's this sort of, we're all about everything. We're about wildlife trafficking. And, not that wildlife trafficking isn't important, but it is not national security. So it was a very, very disappointing first term. And I think really when you have too many priorities, then of course you have no priorities. The second term, thankfully, has been much, much better. I think the President and his advisors heard particularly from African leaders, the first term that this was not going to work. And there have been 2 sort of big events that have happened that I think are potentially long-lasting and potentially quite positive. One is the President one June ago, when he was in Tanzania on a much more significant trip, announced something called Power Africa, which is a U.S. government effort help to bring electricity to the 600 million Africans that wake up every day without electricity. I can talk more about that. And secondly, he held the first ever US-Africa Leaders Summit the first week of August. And frankly, I was a little skeptical that it would go well, but it actually went pretty well. They've committed to doing it again, which may or may not be a good thing, probably a good thing. But what I think was best is that, not that it was a PR circus, which of course it was, as all summits are, but the key agenda items were national security cooperation on real issues and economic issues, namely trade and private investment. I think very, very, very important. Let me end here, I think. I'm gonna maybe try to preempt just 2 questions that I get. No, I won't do that. I won't do that. I won't do that. Let's see if somebody asks this question. Let me just end by just mentioning the Golden Hour book, which I wrote, which is mostly for fun, but also has a serious theme underneath. So when I left the State Department at the end of 2008, I started writing a book about American dysfunction in foreign policy, all about the infighting. I had this one experience in August of 2008, another West African country, Mauritania, had a coup. And Mauritania, I'd never been there, almost nobody's heard of Mauritania, but they actually were an important counterterrorism partner of the United States in that particular corner of the world. And Secretary Rice asked me to go to Nouakchott and tell the general that had just imprisoned and overthrown a presidentially elected president who happened to have sat immediately next to President Bush at a global democracy forum only a few weeks earlier, that we could not accept a coup and he'd have to step down, or we were cutting off our aid and pulling all of our military cooperation. So what transpired was an absolutely surreal experience in political theater. General Aziz, of course, refused, and we did cut our aid program. We moved our troops and our planes to other countries in the region. And I was going to use this, but it was a very interesting and in some ways frustrating, in some ways enlightening debate inside the US government. What do? We have real counterterrorism objectives. We have real democracy objectives. There are real issues, there are symbolic issues here. How do we work this out? Now, I happen to think that we came out in the right place by holding our line on this in this case. I thought that would be a good way to try to explain U.S. government policy making in this complex world. I started writing an outline for a nonfiction book, and I just decided it would be too boring and it wouldn't reach enough people. So I thought, hey, why not, for fun, I'll write a thriller. So I wrote a thriller about a coup in Mali. And I did it in Mali because I thought nobody's heard of Nouakchott, Mauritania. Everybody has heard of Timbuktu, right? So even if they don't know if it's a real place or where it is, it's in northern Mali, it's a real place, it's beautiful. So I wrote a story about an academic who accidentally finds himself in the State Department, and he's tasked to reverse a coup in Mali, and it all runs out from there. And of course, 6 weeks after I finished writing the book, Mali had a real coup in early 2012, and I think that helped me get a publisher like Penguin. Now I'm on the hook for 4 books. Zimbabwe story will be out next year. I'm working on the Cuba story this year, and Tali 4 will probably be Nigeria in 2017. So it's fun, but it's also about it's a lot of, Andrew will like all the bureaucratic infighting and intrigue, and there are some lobbyists in there, but it's also about Africa, real 3-dimensional African characters who are not just objects of US decisions, but they're playing us, if not more than we're playing them, and trying to make Africa seem like a more normal, important place for mainstream Americans who don't think about Africa every day. So why don't I stop there? I'm happy to take any questions. Yes?
So infrastructure is vital, roads and railroads and all that deal are important for getting anything happening. And in the past year or so, of course, the Chinese have all been all over, particularly the Eastern African Railroad gauge standardization. Stuff like that, that's a big opportunity. How do we particularly, how do we use that to further our goals in general?
Okay, good. So that was my first question, is always about China. So that's good. Look, China is investing a huge amount of money in Africa. They come with a very different business model than the United States. The U.S. government does not arrive with a government-owned bank, a government-owned construction company, guarantees. Exxon goes in, they want to do oil. They do not, they do not want to run power plants. They do not want to build highways. They do not want. The Chinese come with these package deals, which frankly are very attractive to African governments that want a lot of infrastructure. They want it built quickly. They want it financed. They can bring packages that we just don't do. It's not our model. I don't think we should try to compete in that. But strategically, I think it's actually very important that we not try to compete. I know on Capitol Hill it looks good to say, look at what the Chinese are doing, we need to get our act together. Occasionally I will use that as a tactic. But 90% of what China is doing in Africa is positive for the United States, and we should be encouraging more of it. There are occasions where we clash either over what do we do about Sudan or what do we do about Robert Mugabe, and occasionally there's a Chinese company competing with an American company. But we should not be mercantilist about this. It's not the right way to think about it. And we certainly should not think of our competition, that the U.S. is competing for influence with China in Africa as a chess game, as a kind of new Cold War. I actually don't think the U.S. government thinks that way, but a lot of people believe it's that way. One time I was visiting, when I was in government, I was visiting Liberia, and a local staffer was explaining where we were putting community radio stations in Liberia, and then explained that we put these two in these towns because the Chinese have put radio stations in those towns. And what struck me is A, this is a terrible idea, but B, that's an absolute, it's the wrong way for the U.S. to decide where to put community radio, but more importantly, it actually struck me that it was an exception. I hadn't heard of that very often, that we were making decisions because of something the Chinese did. And even on occasion, there's a lot of complementarity. There's a college in Monrovia in Liberia where the Chinese built the buildings and the U.S. trained the staff. To me, that's actually a pretty good model, right? The other way around would not be good. So why not try to think of it that way? But we don't have the tools currently to really make big investments in infrastructure. We have something called OPIC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. I happen to be a big fan of OPIC. It's living with its 1974 rules, and it's way smaller than it should be for the United States government. But when we want to get private investment in the power sector in Pakistan or a toll road in West Africa, this is typically our tool is OPIC, but they're not really up to the full task, and we could fix OPIC without new money with some minor tweaks. It's actually one of the major projects I'm working on at CGD. So, yes.
Okay, thank you, first of all. Unfortunately, we have at the moment the Ebola outbreak, which is a case study, I think, to look at some of the things that you've mentioned. I'm interested how you would apply them, particularly thinking of this is a situation that evolves overnight. There are a number of levers that we can use to translate goals into actual policies or actions. But if you look at the White House, 2 weeks ago, I think the 16th of September, they came out with a press release. This is what we are doing for this emergency. Out of the $620 million or so million dollars that are going to be spent, according to the White House, 580 of them are coming out of the DoD. In fact, 500 of them come specifically out of the fund that's the fund we use in Iraq and Afghanistan to militarily intervene in situations. Is that just because those are the levers we can pull, or is it just a particular choice of policy? Do we have other choices? Because USAID accounted for 10% perhaps.
So I'm a little nervous answering this question with Andrew in the room, but I'll give it a shot. But there's I'm not within shooting distance. So. There's very little discretionary money. So it's like we have a fire drill every time there's a fire, right? Instead of building a fire department, we just expect the DoD will come in and we have to, do this again and again. I think the Ebola, so there is no sort of pot of money sitting at AID where they can deploy $500 million for emergencies that weren't foreseen by Congress. Congress, in its wisdom, has just not done that. Even for things that we've committed to doing, often the money isn't necessarily there. So it's partly about our very fragmented budget structure. It's also partly that, again, authorities and capacity is spread among many agencies. And in the Ebola crisis, there was this particular problem which I'm willing to accept, which is that there were some aspects of it that had never been done before. So the US government knows how to do famine relief. They've done it dozens of times, they know how to do it well. There are some contingency facilities in place for that because of the regularity. There is no handbook on Ebola control. It's just never happened before at this scale. That said, I do think because there are at least 6, if not more, agencies involved, and the White House was very slow to exert its authority, partly because of internal Washington issues, but also because there were problems at WHO and some of the international agencies that were supposed to be responding but did not. 6 months ago, CDC declared an Ebola outbreak. 2 months ago, the Peace Corps pulled their volunteers from the 3 affected areas. And so it took, a month ago, more than a month before the White House announcement, there was that outbreak of violence in Monrovia that, by reading the newspaper, you'd say, this is not being contained, like this is an out of control situation. There still was a very, very slow response. And when you look at the dynamics of Ebola, the charts all go like this. Even, a week is going to cost hundreds, if not thousands of lives, 1 week. So it was all these things coming together that led to a very, very slow response. If there was one agency and it had a clear mandate, the White House gave it the authority and the resources to do it, they can react much more quickly. And the DoD came in, frankly, very, very reluctantly, and only because nobody else had that kind of capacity to deploy 3,000 people to build. They're building, I think, 18 or some large number of treatment units from scratch, right? You can look on Facebook and see literally pictures of people pouring concrete for the facilities. So I think it was an unfortunate range of events, series of things that came together. What I hope is that the hysteria over Ebola doesn't get too great, and that people are already canceling trips. If this doesn't get contained quickly, you'll start to see investment projects canceled, if not delayed. A lot of hedge fund managers were very nervous about going to Nigeria already. This just gives them another reason not to go. This sort of risk aversion potential could be quite high. Yes.
Yes. First of all, thank you for emphasizing what I think is the premise from which Africa should always be researched and talked about, which is that it is not stagnant. Because it's not just about when people bash Africa, even those who romanticize about Africa, who claim they love Africa to death, tend to think of it as this static place that they can always return to. So I'm happy that we emphasize that's the premise. We have to start from there. Also, I'm glad that you also put at the center of your consideration of Africa development, that it's about economic development, and not just as African countries, as people looking for handout, but as partners who want to work together in terms of development. My question has to do with the diaspora, and not just the historical diaspora of like African Americans or Afro-Brazilians, but the new diasporas, post-colonial migration of Africans who are around the world and doing very well, and collectively as well as individually, and not just in the United States, but North America in general, Asia and Europe. African governments now have realized that the diaspora is crucial to development, to the extent that many African governments have developed diaspora bureaus and things like that to make that connection. My question is, what about the United States government? Is it beginning to place that kind of significance on the diaspora and harnessing the diaspora in making policy towards Africa?
So I agree with the premise, absolutely. I mean, if you look at the boom in Nigeria and other African banks, it's mostly bankers that went to New York or London, got trained up, came home, and built a business. That dynamic, I think, absolutely can apply to all kinds, even just look at McKinsey and Company and the number of Africans working in McKinsey that get moved around to Dubai and Beijing and London and Paris, and then they go to Joburg and they start spinning off businesses. Potential there is tremendous. I can't recall the exact figures, but the business success rates and education rates for African immigrants to the United States are like through the roof, among the most successful immigrant groups, which is helping to change the perception a lot. On the policy side, the U.S. has a really hard time, like all countries, hard time leveraging our immigration policy for other benefits. It will get tied up, I think, a little bit in the H-1B high-skill visa question, but again, partially because of structure, partially because of politics, I think we're going to underperform there, unfortunately. So, why don't I take, how much time do we have?
We have 7 more minutes.
Okay, why don't I take maybe 3 more quick questions, and I'll take them all together. So, the back, here, and, okay, just 2, good. Okay, and 3, yes.
Let's go back to China for a minute. This deal that I'm not going to tell you the country, it's a big African country. Chinese came in, they offered $3 billion in loans. The country would never see the money. The loans would be paid to 3 state-owned Chinese companies, construction companies, mostly construction companies, to build 2,000 miles of highway, 3 college campuses, 6 hospitals, and 8,000 units of housing. Looked great. And the U.S. ambassador was telling me about it, and then I went to see the Prime Minister of the country, and I said, Prime Minister, how are you repaying the $3 billion? None of which you're seeing. I mean, and that's fine. You might not want them to see the cash, particularly in this particular country that has a reputation for egregious corruption. So, and the Prime Minister said, Andrew, we need all this. I said, you do. How are you going to pay for this? Well, the Chinese, it says it in the contract, the Chinese can mine up to $3 billion worth of minerals from our country to pay the loan off. And I said, I see, and you have a large bureaucracy of inspectors who are going to carefully make sure they're not taking more than $3 billion. He said, well, actually, we don't have that. No, and I said, even if you did, you know what the Chinese might do? They might bribe the inspectors. He said, yeah, that might be a problem too. I said, how will you know when they get to the $3 billion? And there was silence. So I said, you could see this in a cynical way as an invitation to looting your natural resources. And there was silence again. I said, you have considered the possibility that that's what this is. And he didn't argue with me, which I thought was interesting. Okay? So I don't know whether I don't think the 2,000 miles of highway were ever built. Okay? But how do you respond to that? Because that is the kind of deal they sign.
Okay, good question. Yes.
Yeah, my question is, Obama's failure in his policies towards Africa during his first term, would you attribute that to part of the fact that he was actually trying to seem as if he's not too engaged in Africa because of the politics in Washington, the fact that people are saying, oh, he's born in Kenya, and the suspicion that we're thinking he's going to do a lot for Africa. Can you attribute it to that?
Last question.
I'm just interested in what you think the role of the modern South Africa should be and what the politics there are going to do
Yeah.
for South Africa.
Okay, 3 excellent questions. I'll take them in reverse order. So South Africa, look, it's obviously a hub. Until last year, until the Nigerians counted correctly, it was the largest economy in Africa. It's now smaller than Nigeria's economy. South Africa is really stuck. It is a low growth economy. They're growing at 1 to 3% a year. The politics are incredibly stagnant and really locked and very, very inward looking. I mean, it is a stretch for South Africa to intervene in Lesotho, a country in which it entirely encircles. And its attempts to get involved diplomatically in places like Cote d'Ivoire have been complete disasters, if not totally counterproductive. So South Africa is going through its own internal issues which mean that right now it is just not playing a leadership role in Africa. The rest of the continent sure as hell does not want it to play a leadership role. And at least for the next few years, I don't see that changing. It's actually been just a massive disappointment. And I think that the U.S. has a particularly prickly relationship with the South Africans, which certainly the Obama administration thought it was all about the Iraq War and about the Bush administration. They tried to do a reset, like Russia style, and it went absolutely nowhere. So, I mean, our relations with South Africa are terrible. They're barely working relations. So that I think has been a big problem, and I think really there's very little for the U.S. to do other than wait for South Africa to grow out of this difficult period. On Obama's first term, absolutely. This is the reverse of Nixon going to China, right? He did not want to be seen as too close after all the nonsense during the campaign. Even given that, even given the financial crisis, even given all of the other things going on around the world, the United States government can walk and chew gum at the same time. We put, it's a very strong signal where you have important players in Washington that can make decisions and do big things inside the White House versus people that are clearly caretakers. And you can tell when the administration wants to accomplish things and when the administration just wants to just not have any problems. And it's a very different posture. And so it wasn't just that he didn't embrace Africa in a way that certainly the African leaders would have hoped. It's that it was much worse than that. It was getting toward sort of wanton neglect to a way that people were done. There are lots of capitals in Africa I would go and they would say, we don't know, we don't understand what's going on. So it didn't have to be that bad. The question on the Chinese deal, look, the big issue with a lot of these Chinese deals is that they're very opaque. Chinese government could sign a line of credit with the government of Angola for $10 billion. It might be a great deal for Angola. It might be a terrible deal for Angola. Nobody has any idea what the terms are because it's not disclosed. As a loan by the U.S. government or the German government to the government of Angola would be on open terms. So you at least know what the interest rate was. Chinese deals, you don't know what the interest rates are. And when they're closed, particularly in difficult, complicated environments like your mining example, the potential for side deals on both, by both parties negotiating it are tremendous. And the likelihood that it's going to go bad are huge when it's very complicated. There's all kinds of contingencies, and nobody knows. You can't judge whether it's a good deal or not. I've grown just extremely skeptical of announcements of big deals are almost never real. So you actually want to see what real deals are. There's a very good political scientist named Deborah Brodigan, who's done a lot of work looking at Chinese land deals and Chinese mining deals and investment deals, and she finds the vast, vast majority of them are big announcements, ribbon-cutting exercises during diplomatic visits, but they're not actually real deals. That said, you visit any African capital, you are almost certainly to find large Chinese construction projects underway. So there is a lot of real stuff getting done, and get back to the very first question, Africa needs a ton of infrastructure. And frankly, the Chinese are really good at it. So why would you not want them in there doing that? You know, asset stripping, I'm sure there's some of that going on. We would hope that disclosure would help mitigate some of that. But I actually think that, again, this goes back to your point about Africans being active agents in these negotiations. The Chinese are not going to outsmart the Africans on these deals. I am very confident that the bad deals, the Chinese are going to be the ones left holding the bag on some of these deals. So I don't think that there's any, you know, in certain countries, Nigeria, Congo come to mind, they are not going to get beaten by the Chinese in their own backyard. It's just not going to happen. I don't know, at least that's my hope.
We must end now.